The day after humiliating a journalist, he saw her face on the news and couldn't believe what he had done. The sun dipped low over Penn Station in New York City, casting long shadows as passengers hurried to catch their trains, eager to return home. Among them was a woman with a worn leather satchel slung over her shoulder. Her posture was upright, her expression calm yet focused. She moved with a quiet confidence that only came from years of experience, though her eyes carried a hint of weariness, the kind born from long days spent far from home. Danielle Carter, an award-winning investigative journalist, had just returned from an assignment in a war-torn country. All she wanted tonight was to sink into her seat, close her eyes, and imagine the joy of reuniting with her family after months apart. As she stepped onto the train, her presence drew a few passing glances. Some passengers gave polite nods of recognition. Others averted their eyes. She didn't mind. She was used to blending into the background. What Danielle didn't anticipate was the man seated a row behind her. From the moment she walked past him, his eyes narrowed and his lips curled into a sneer. She could feel his silent judgment as she stowed her bag and took her seat. He had the air of someone who didn't keep his opinions to himself, and it was only a matter of time before the cabin heard them loud and clear. As more passengers boarded, Danielle retrieved a small photo tucked inside her satchel, a snapshot of her son and daughter grinning at a summer picnic. The image was her lifeline, grounding her no matter how far she traveled. Her quiet moment, however, was broken by a sharp, disdainful voice. "Figures," the man said loudly, his tones slicing through the soft murmur of the cabin. "They'll let anyone call themselves a journalist these days." Danielle didn't flinch. She kept her gaze on the photo, inhaling deeply to steady herself. But the man wasn't done. What's she writing? Fluff pieces? Probably hasn't uncovered anything meaningful in her life. What he didn't know was that Danielle had faced unimaginable risks, exposed deep corruption, and ventured where most wouldn't dare. But for now, she chose silence. The chatter in the cabin fell away as more passengers turned their attention to the man's words. A few exchanged uneasy glances, but no one intervened. Danielle sat still, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the photo. She'd faced worse than this. Much worse. Still, the man's blatant disrespect settled uncomfortably in her chest. He leaned back, smug and relishing the attention. He looked to be in his early 30s, casually dressed in a graphic tee and jeans, his expression oozing self-satisfaction. "You know," he continued, addressing no one in particular, "real journalists, the ones who actually do the hard work, don't need awards just for showing up. It's all just for show now." Danielle's jaw tightened, but her composure didn't falter. The woman seated beside her, a young mother cradling a toddler, leaned in and whispered, "Are you okay?" Danielle nodded, offering a faint smile. She didn't need to defend herself to someone like him. Her work and sacrifices spoke louder than any words could. Yet the man persisted. "Bet she's never even left a newsroom," he muttered, his voice carrying enough for nearby passengers to hear. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Across the aisle, an older gentleman leaned forward, preparing to speak, but his wife tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "Don't, it'll only escalate things." Danielle remained composed. Her training had taught her how to assess situations, to discern when action was necessary and when silence was wiser. This was clearly a time for the latter. Yet she couldn't stop herself from wondering, what made this man feel so entitled to tear her down without knowing a thing about her? Was it her profession, her skin, or simply his own insecurities spilling out for everyone to see? The train conductor, a petite woman with a warm yet weary smile, moved briskly through the cabin, her presence briefly interrupting the tension. She stopped near Danielle's row, her sharp eyes flicking between the journalist and the man whose voice had drawn so much attention. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her tone polite but firm, laced with quiet authority. "Oh, everything's fine," the man replied with a smirk, leaning back in his seat. "Just sharing some observations. Don't worry, I wouldn't want to hurt anyone's delicate feelings." His words dripped with mockery, and the conductor's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed like she might say more, but instead she gave a curt nod and continued down the aisle, clearly uneasy but unsure how to intervene. Danielle exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She'd encountered men like this before, the kind who pushed boundaries just to see how much they could get away with. The train jolted slightly as it pulled away from the station, and Danielle closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the seat. The man's jabs didn't stop. He spoke intermittently, his words full of condescension, each one sharper than the last. Yet Danielle remained motionless, her silence a quiet declaration of strength. She didn't need to react. She knew who she was, what she'd done, and what she was capable of. His words might irritate, but they could never diminish her. Still, the air in the cabin was heavy with discomfort. His comments weren't just directed at her. They rippled outward, affecting everyone around them. Passengers shifted uneasily, stealing glances at Danielle, at the man, and then at each other, silently questioning whether they should step in. But no one did. As the train sped through the city, Danielle's mind drifted far from the cabin and the man's ignorant remarks. Her thoughts traveled back to the streets of the war-torn country she had just left. Those streets had tested her courage and resilience every single day. She had spent nearly a decade as an investigative journalist, her work not merely about telling stories, but exposing truths. Truths that often came at great personal risk. One particular assignment came rushing back, vivid and raw. She had been investigating a massive corruption scandal involving powerful officials. It was a story fraught with danger, with threats that loomed over her at every turn. She remembered the night she received the tip, information about a hidden cache of documents that could expose the corruption. Her informant had begged her to stay away, warning of the risks. But Danielle couldn't ignore it. That night, under the cover of darkness, she had ventured into an abandoned warehouse. Her camera and notebook were her only companions as she navigated the crumbling structure. The air was damp and heavy, each creak of the floorboards echoing like a warning. She found the documents, concealed in a dusty file box. But just as she was about to leave, she heard footsteps. Men emerged from the shadows, armed and masked. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She hid the documents under her coat and feigned confusion, claiming she was lost. Her voice was steady, even as fear coursed through her veins. Somehow, they let her go, but not without a warning. Never return. The story that followed exposed a network of corruption reaching the highest levels of power. It saved lives, brought justice to those who'd been wronged, and left Danielle with months of sleepless nights. But she hadn't done it for accolades or recognition. She had done it for the people, the ones who had been silenced and oppressed. Faces came to mind, clear as day. She thought of the family she'd met during that investigation. A mother and her 2 children who had lost everything because of the corruption. Their gratitude, even in the depths of their suffering, was something she carried with her always. These were the moments that truly defined her. Not the headlines, not the awards, but the lives she changed. Still, she had faced struggles far beyond the stories she wrote. There were times her credibility was questioned, not because of her work, but because of her gender and the color of her skin. She had endured sly remarks from colleagues and critics who doubted her talent. Yet every single time, she proved them wrong. She rose above their judgment, letting her work speak louder than their prejudice ever could. On the train, Danielle opened her eyes, the memories vivid and raw. She glanced at the man sitting a row behind her, now busy scrolling through his phone, seemingly pleased with his earlier comments. She didn't hate him. Hatred was a burden she had long since learned to release. Instead, she felt a quiet determination. This man didn't know her story, and likely never would. But his ignorance would never diminish the truth of who she was. Life, however, has a way of revealing truths, sometimes in unexpected ways. And for Danielle, the events of the next day would make that abundantly clear. The following morning, Ethan Carter sat in a busy cafe in Los Angeles, sipping his coffee as sunlight streamed through the windows. His mornings were always the same: breakfast, editing his latest travel vlog, and browsing the news. He opened his laptop, and the screen flickered to life with a news broadcast. The anchor's tone was solemn, filled with respect. "This morning, we honor a true hero of journalism," the anchor announced. Danielle Carter, an investigative journalist who risked her life to expose corruption and seek justice for the voiceless. Ethan froze, his coffee cup hovering midair. The screen showed a photo of a woman with a calm yet determined expression. His chest tightened. It was her, the woman from the train. The report continued, detailing her fearless work. It spoke of the corruption she had uncovered, the risks she had taken, and the dangers she had faced. They shared stories of her time in war zones, where she gave a voice to those silenced by oppression. A villager interviewed through a translator said, "She saved us. If not for her, we would have lost everything. She has a heart of gold." Ethan's stomach churned as he placed his coffee down, his hands trembling. The anchor went on to list Danielle's many accolades, including a prestigious award for her courage. "This is the kind of bravery that often goes unnoticed," the anchor concluded. "Today, we honor Danielle Carter, a journalist who exemplified integrity and fearlessness." Ethan couldn't take his eyes off the screen. It felt like the air had been knocked out of him. The woman he had insulted and belittled on the train was nothing short of a hero. His cruel words from the previous day echoed in his mind. He remembered the calm in her eyes, the quiet strength with which she endured his mockery. She didn't fight back or defend herself. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than his words ever could. Ethan slumped into his chair, overwhelmed by a wave of shame. He had spent years believing his perspective was the only one that mattered. But now, he was confronted with a painful truth. He had been so terribly wrong. Guilt began to settle heavily in his chest. He couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to make amends, or if he would have to carry this regret for the rest of his life. Ethan spent the rest of the morning in a haze, replaying the events on the train over and over. He thought of the pride in his voice as he ridiculed her, the dignity with which she sat silently absorbing his words without reacting. Now, he could picture her expression as she endured his hate, calm and composed, even in the face of cruelty. The shame was almost unbearable. He paced the small cafe, his thoughts spiraling. Danielle Carter had survived unimaginable challenges, yet carried herself with grace and honor. What had he done in comparison? He had torn her down for no reason but his own ignorance. Driven by guilt, Ethan searched her name online and devoured every article he could find. He read about the stories she had exposed, the lives she had changed, and the sacrifices she had made to uncover the truth. Her work was extraordinary, and she had never sought recognition. She simply did what was right. But the more he learned, the heavier his guilt grew. His actions on the train weren't just a lapse in judgment. They revealed something darker, something he hadn't wanted to face about himself. For years, he had clung to shallow biases, viewing the world through a narrow and selfish lens. Danielle's story shattered that illusion, leaving him with a raw and painful truth. Ethan knew he couldn't undo the harm he had caused. His words were already spoken, his actions witnessed by everyone on that train. Still, he felt compelled to do something, even if only for his conscience. He thought about contacting the train company to leave a message for Danielle, but what could he possibly say? "I'm sorry," felt so small, so insufficient. Instead, he chose to act. Ethan donated to an organization that supported journalists in dangerous conditions. It wasn't enough, it would never be enough, but it was a start. He also wrote a letter to Danielle, pouring out his apology with unfiltered honesty. He admitted how deeply her story had affected him and expressed regret for his behavior. He ended the letter with these words: "You didn't deserve my hate. You deserved my respect, and I failed to give it. I will carry that failure with me forever, but I promise to do better. Thank you for your courage and for being a better person than I ever was." Ethan didn't know if the letter would reach her, but writing it felt like a step toward taking responsibility. It wasn't about easing his guilt. It was about acknowledging the hurt he had caused and committing to change. Sometimes the most profound lessons don't come from grand gestures, but from quiet self-reflection. Ethan's journey toward understanding had only just begun. A week later, he sat in the same cafe, staring out the window. He didn't know if Danielle had received his letter or if she ever would. But something had shifted within him. He realized guilt alone wasn't enough. Change required action. It required seeing people for who they truly were, not who he assumed them to be. He turned off his laptop and sat quietly, thinking of Danielle. Her story taught him a lesson he hadn't been ready to learn. Everyone carries their own struggles, some far heavier than others. The least anyone can do is offer respect, especially when understanding seems hardest. Ethan wasn't a hero, he never would be. But he hoped, in his small way, to live with the kind of courage Danielle showed every day. Not just the courage to face danger, but the courage to confront his own flaws and strive to be better.